Welcome back, horror fans, to another terrifying episode. Tonight we'll be sharing 3 chilling true horror stories from Fall Night's Tales that will make you rethink the comforting autumn breeze and the warm glow of fall candles. These stories are not your typical spooky tales. They come from real experiences that will send chills down your spine. But before we dive in, I want to thank each of you for your incredible support. Your comments, likes, and subscriptions keep this channel alive, and we're beyond grateful for this growing community. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and get ready for a journey into the unsettling unknown. Let's begin. Story 1: The Curse of the Autumn Decor. There are moments in life when a seemingly innocent thought grows roots in your mind and begins to twist, to burrow into the deepest parts of your consciousness. It begins as something innocuous and impulse, perhaps, but as it takes hold, it warps until you cannot help but feel its weight pressing down on your very soul. The decision to decorate our new home was, on its surface, one of those moments, a simple gesture, one that many would deem perfectly natural and even charming. But to me, it marked the beginning of something far more disturbing. It had been several weeks since Carter and I moved into the house, an old, sagging structure that seemed both familiar and alien. There was something about it that unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. It stood there on the edge of the street, out of place and yet oddly fitting, like an abandoned dream forgotten by the world. When we arrived, it seemed almost too perfect for us, a place where we could begin again, where the past might be put behind us and the weight of the world could be lifted from our shoulders. But it never felt right. Perhaps it was the silence. The house seemed to breathe in its own peculiar way, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. But that was not the thought in my mind when I decided to buy the decorations. I had thought it a good idea to surprise Carter, to add a touch of life to the house, to make it feel warmer, more like home. It was the end of September, the air had turned crisp and brittle, and the season called for change, for something to mark the passage of time. Fall was here, with its promise of transformation, of colors fading into reds and golds, of pumpkins and harvest moons. I imagined how pleased Carter would be when he came home to a house filled with the bright oranges and yellows of autumn, when the flickering light of candles would cast dancing shadows on the walls. In my mind, it was a perfect image of what we should be: happy, peaceful, secure. I was wrong, of course. Facebook Marketplace, everyone's go-to treasure trove, was the obvious choice. I had heard countless stories about people finding gems there, old furniture, knickknacks, and various odds and ends, sometimes discarded by those who no longer cared, sometimes carefully curated by others who had a strange sort of taste for forgotten things. But it was in the latter category that I found the listing fall decorations, a large plastic bin of them, stacked high with miniature pumpkins, dried leaves, strings of lights, all neatly packed into the container for a mere $20. The price was too good to resist, and I didn't even think twice about the seller. The man's name was Cody, and his Facebook profile was sparse, almost clinical. A few posts, some of them vague, others disconcerting in their lack of coherence. There was something about the absence of information, the absence of warmth, that felt off, but I pushed the feeling aside. It was, after all, just a transaction. One of life's many transactions. Nothing to fear. Nothing at all. The address was in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, an area that felt, for lack of a better word, wrong. As we drove deeper into the district, I could feel a strange weight in the air, like the atmosphere itself had thickened and become more oppressive. The houses on either side of the street were grim, worn, and weathered, their facades peeling away like the skin of a corpse. The lawns were unkempt, the sidewalks cracked, and there was a peculiar stillness that made my skin prickle. The houses seemed as though they were leaning in on us, their windows watching our every move. The trees overhead, once full of life, now stood as skeletons, twisted, gnarled things that seemed to know something I didn't. The whole place had the feel of something abandoned long ago, a place where time itself had come to a standstill. When we arrived at the address, I knew we had made a mistake. The house was even worse than I imagined, and I could feel the pulse of dread beginning to beat in my chest. The porch light flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows over the cracked steps. The door stood ajar, and I noticed, with a cold jolt of realization, that there were no cars in the driveway, no signs of life. Just the oppressive silence, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Carter turned to me, but I could barely meet his gaze. He hadn't noticed it, or if he had, he wasn't saying anything. I didn't want to voice my discomfort, didn't want to admit that something felt terribly wrong about this place. Something in the air, the texture of it, the thickness, the way the shadows clung to the corners of the porch made it impossible to ignore. And yet there we were, standing at the threshold of this strange house, our hearts pounding in the quiet. I rang the doorbell, the sound of it dull, as though the house itself had absorbed it. We waited, and waited, no answer. Then the door creaked open, slowly as if reluctant to reveal the secret it was hiding. Cody stood there, his figure more like a shadow than a person. He was of average height, not at all remarkable in appearance, but there was something deeply unsettling in his presence. His eyes too wide, too still stared at us, empty but full at the same time, like a void staring back at us from the deep recesses of the universe. His mouth was tight, his face too smooth, as if it had been carved from stone. He said nothing for a long moment, and I found myself instinctively stepping back, not out of fear necessarily, but because something about him, something about the space around him suggested that I should not, under any circumstances, be here. Yet still, I said nothing, and neither did Carter. We simply stood there, frozen for a moment, as if suspended in time. When he spoke, it was not in a voice I recognized as human. It was soft, too soft, as if it had been filtered through something, a device, a veil, a dream. He invited us in, but the invitation itself seemed wrong, too polite, too rehearsed. The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with some unknown presence, and for a moment I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. But the words had already left my mouth. I found myself stepping over the threshold, pulling Sally along behind me as though caught in a trance. Carter followed without a word. Once inside, I was immediately struck by the overwhelming stench. It was impossible to place, but it clung to the air, thick and nauseating. It was not the smell of rot or decay, though it was something close, something ancient, something that had soaked into the very fibers of the house itself. The air was saturated with it, as if the house had absorbed the misery of its past residents and was now exhaling it back at us in the form of this putrid smell. I wanted to leave. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn around and run, but I found myself unable to move. It was as though the house had planted its feet in my mind, anchoring me to the spot. Cody led us further into the living room. There in the middle of the room stood a large red container. It was not particularly striking, just a plastic bin, the kind one might use to store seasonal decorations, but it held a certain presence, a certain malignancy. It was too large, too imposing for what it contained. I could not explain why, but I knew in the deepest part of my mind that the bin was not just an object, it was a marker, a symbol. Something darker than it appeared, something that didn't belong in this house. My heart raced as I caught sight of it, and I could feel the room closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. The air was heavy now, thick with the stench and the weight of something unseen. Sally's hand brushed mine, and for a moment we stood there together, our eyes fixed on the container. There was nothing in it that we could see, nothing that would have given us reason to be alarmed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring back at us, watching us, waiting for us. The silence stretched on, suffocating in its intensity. I wanted to speak, to ask what the hell was going on, to demand an explanation. But my throat was dry, my tongue heavy in my mouth. The words wouldn't come. We left quickly, the sense of dread mounting with every step. I didn't know how we made it back to the car, but when we did, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the thud of it echoing in the hollow silence of the car as we drove away. The air in the car seemed thick too, as though the stench from the house had followed us, clinging to our clothes, to our skin. I didn't speak. Neither did Sally. I didn't need to say anything. We both knew. The next day, Carter went back. He had questions, I suppose, though I couldn't understand what could possibly compel him to return to that house. He came back with a look on his face that I will never forget. The house was still there, still decaying, but there was a change. The woman who lived there, an elderly lady, had no knowledge of Cody. She seemed evasive, confused when Carter asked about him, as though she were hiding something. And yet her confusion felt rehearsed, as if she had been forced to memorize a lie. Carter didn't know what to make of it either. But I didn't need to know the answers. I didn't want to. It was enough to know that something had happened, something that couldn't be explained, something that had lodged itself deep in my mind. I have never spoken to Carter about it again, and I don't plan to. Sometimes when I am alone in the house, I think I can hear the faintest echo of footsteps outside. But when I go to the window, the street is always empty, always silent. But it is not the silence that scares me. It is what lingers beneath it. The feeling of being watched, of something standing just behind me, waiting for something, waiting for me. Story 2: Terrifying Encounter at DuPont State Forest. I've often wondered if solitude is truly a gift, as people claim, or if it is a kind of hidden curse, an exposure to a deeper, more oppressive reality. It's one of those ideas that eludes explanation, the kind you cannot voice aloud, and even when whispered, feels like the barest of truths, too uncomfortable to linger in the light of day. I've been left to grapple with it after the things I saw in DuPont State Forest alone. What I thought would be a peaceful, quiet hike turned out to be something far worse, something that stretched far beyond anything I was prepared for. The day I set out from Asheville, I felt the familiar tug of the mountains in my chest. I had been living there for just over a month, having fled from the gnawing disquiet of my previous life, seeking a clean slate, something more natural. People speak of fresh starts, but they never mention how the past follows you, how it never truly leaves, no matter how far you go. There's no escape from the things inside you. The morning I chose to hike was damp, a low mist hanging over the land like a blanket smothering the horizon. As I packed my bag, the weight of it felt insignificant against the quiet suffocation of the air. There was something off-kilter about the world that day. I couldn't put my finger on it. The atmosphere had a kind of density to it, a peculiar thickness that pressed in from every side. I dismissed it, of course, at first, and that was the mistake I made. It's always the small things you ignore, the things that seem too inconsequential to matter. But they do, and I would learn that truth too late. DuPont State Forest was a popular place for locals, known for its scenic waterfalls, its trail loops that stretched through dense woods and open meadows. It should have been idyllic, even peaceful. But as soon as I stepped onto the trail, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't overt, not at first. The path stretched before me, winding like a snake through the towering trees, their branches swaying, even in the absence of wind. But the deeper I ventured, the heavier the air became. It felt as though I was being pulled into something, dragged by an invisible force, even though I was moving of my own accord. Then, as if summoned by the stillness, I saw her. She was standing off to the side of the path, a figure nearly hidden between the trunks of two large pines. At first, I thought it was some trick of the light, a shadow cast in such a way that it suggested a human form. But no. There she was, unmistakably, a woman older, with graying hair that fell in long strands around her shoulders, dressed in dark, worn clothes that seemed too old for this time, as if they belonged to another era altogether. She was standing absolutely still, her gaze fixed upon me. At first, I froze. It was a moment of confusion, as though I were seeing her, but not quite believing it. Her presence was so out of place, so utterly foreign to the environment around her, that it took a long moment before the words "this is wrong" began to creep into my mind. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally so, staring directly at me with an intensity I couldn't fathom. They were too large, too dark, set in a face that seemed to have been worn down by time itself. There was something about the way she looked at me, something that felt wrong. It wasn't that she was angry or malevolent, no, it was worse. Her stare was empty, like a void, as though she had no need for my acknowledgement, no interest in me as a person. I was nothing to her. She was nothing to me. And yet, in that moment, I felt the full weight of her presence in a way that went beyond fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And then, before I could process what was happening, she disappeared. One moment there, the next gone, as if the very forest had swallowed her whole. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to reconcile what I had just seen with the world I knew. It wasn't that I thought I had imagined it, no, it felt too real, too substantial. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was nothing. A trick of my senses, a hallucination perhaps. But the truth is, I didn't feel safe anymore. Not in the way I had before. I tried to continue my hike, but each step felt heavier than the last, the woods closing in around me. Every rustling of leaves, every creak of the branches seemed to have meaning now. The air felt dense with expectation, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing behind me, nothing except the steady, unbroken rows of trees. But then it happened again. She was there. In the distance, standing between the trees, her figure more pronounced this time, her head tilted slightly to the side, watching, always watching. I wanted to scream, to demand some explanation, but my voice stuck in my throat. Instead, I found myself moving forward, moving away from her, though she seemed to be keeping pace with me, appearing just around each bend in the path, just enough to remain within my sight. I was not hallucinating this time. She was real. She was following me. But why? I met another hiker, a weathered man with a stubble-lined jaw, and a look that suggested he had seen things in these woods, things that had no place in the world we understand. He looked at me with the same knowing expression I had seen on the faces of others who had crossed her path. He said, as if confirming some unspoken truth. The woman. You've seen her, haven't you? I nodded, my throat tight. She's always here, he continued, his voice a whisper, though there was no one else around to hear, always watching. Don't worry, she won't hurt you. But you can't escape her. Not really. I didn't know how to respond to that. I couldn't comprehend what he was saying. Escape. Was that even possible? He gave me a long look, the kind of look that made me feel as though he had been waiting for me all along, as though we were both players in a game we couldn't understand. If you're lucky, he muttered, you'll never see her face again. His words haunted me. The walk back to my car was a blur. I remember nothing of the path I retraced, my mind occupied with the image of the woman, of her eyes, of the endless, hollow gaze that had followed me from the woods and into the realms of my thoughts. That night, in the comfort of my cabin, I tried to forget. I tried to convince myself it was just an accident, a trick of the light, a symptom of too much isolation. But sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay awake, staring into the dark, my thoughts a whirlpool of panic and confusion. The room felt oppressive, the air thick with something unseen. I kept hearing things, a rustling, a whisper, a shift in the darkness, but when I looked, there was nothing. And then I saw her. She was standing at the foot of my bed, just as she had been in the woods. The same pale, empty eyes. The same worn, dated clothing. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there staring. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I could only stare back, paralyzed, as she watched me as the seconds stretched into minutes, into hours, until I lost all sense of time, all sense of the world around me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, disjointed rhythm that did not belong in this space, in this moment. The weight of her gaze pressed down on me, suffocating, until I thought I would collapse beneath it. And then, just as I was certain I would lose my mind, she was gone. I awoke the next morning, drenched in sweat, my body trembling as though I had been caught in the grip of some terrible fever. The room was empty, quiet, but the lingering presence of the woman remained, clinging to the space like a shadow, a sickness that had infected my very being. My father called that morning, his voice unusually stiff, as though he were trying to speak through a veil of grief. "Your aunt," he said. "She passed away last night." I froze. The room spun. The words made no sense. My aunt? I had not spoken to her in years. We were estranged, our paths had diverged long ago, and yet, in that moment I remembered her. I remembered her face, vague, distorted by time, but unmistakably hers. It was her face I had seen in the woods, staring at me with those vacant eyes. I couldn't understand how it could be. I didn't want to. But the image of the woman standing at the foot of my bed was now irrevocably tied to my aunt's death. The coincidence was too much to bear, too unnatural. I left DuPont State Forest that day and never returned. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to leave. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see her, the woman, my aunt. And I can't escape her. Story 3: The Unseen Horror in the Abandoned House. Kittery. The house on the outskirts of Brunswick had been a subject of whispered tales for as long as I could remember. No one dared approach it, not the curious children, not the thrill seekers, not even the drunkards who staggered home through the woods at night. It sat on the edge of the town, nestled in a thicket of dense trees, its crumbling exterior barely visible beneath a blanket of overgrown foliage. Its reputation preceded it not as a haunted house, but as a place forgotten by time, a place that did not want to be remembered, a place that seemed to resist being discovered. And yet, despite all the warnings, despite the collective memory of those who had lived nearby, I found myself drawn to it. It wasn't that I believed the stories, at least not consciously. It was simply that something about it called to me. It began with a dream, I think a dream of darkened hallways and shadowed rooms, of a place forgotten but still alive. I had to see it. I had to understand what it was. I arrived at dusk, the light of the day bleeding out of the sky, leaving behind a sickly yellow-gray that made the world seem dim, as if the very air were clogged with something thick and oppressive. The house loomed in the distance, more a vague silhouette than a structure, its once proud frame barely holding itself together. The vines twisted around its walls, their gnarled fingers creeping into the crumbling windows like parasites. They blurred the boundaries of the house, as if it were trying to hide itself in plain view. I could smell it even from here: decay, rot, a putrid combination of things that had been dead for far too long. I don't know why I continued, why I moved toward it with each step, despite the gnawing feeling of wrongness that twisted in my gut. It wasn't a simple fear. No, it was a more insidious kind of dread. A realization almost too late, that this place was not something meant to be discovered, that it was better left untouched, left to its own slow, silent decay. But I went forward, as though the choice were not mine. The door was ajar when I arrived, its hinges rusted, as if it hadn't been opened in years, or had it been months, decades. I couldn't be sure. It stood there, creaking softly as though inviting me in, or perhaps warning me to stay away. But I pushed through the frame anyway. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it, the pressing weight of the house upon me, the thickness of the air, as if I were stepping into a different world entirely. The house, I soon realized, wasn't just abandoned. It was preserved like a specimen in a jar, locked away from the world, kept in an impossible stasis. It had the unmistakable feel of something ancient, something that had endured, but only just. The walls seemed to pulse, if you could call it that, as though the house itself was breathing. It exhaled that familiar, cloying smell of mildew and rot. The air was thick with the scent of dust, of forgotten things. Of time itself standing still, refusing to move forward. Each room was an impossible distortion of space. Hallways stretched too long, doorways too small. Some walls bowed outward like the ribs of a great beast, the furniture leaning as though caught in a slow-motion collapse. A single chair sat in the middle of a room, turned toward an empty wall, as if waiting for someone to sit. And yet nothing had changed. Nothing had moved. It was as though the house had never been touched, never been lived in, never been forgotten. It simply was, and that perhaps was the most unsettling thing of all. As I walked deeper into the house, a low hum filled my ears. It wasn't loud enough to pinpoint, but it was there, lingering in the background like a presence that was too subtle to acknowledge yet too persistent to ignore. It wasn't a sound that made sense. It was like the building itself was speaking in a language beyond my understanding, its whispers leaking from the cracks in the walls. I moved through the rooms, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight, and the faint light filtering through the grime-streaked windows painted everything in an eerie, half-formed glow. It was as though the house existed in a state of half-light, caught between day and night, and it made everything feel wrong. As though it were waiting for the moment when it could fully reveal itself to me. The sense of being watched was pervasive. It clung to me like a heavy cloak, and at times I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, as if some invisible observer stood just out of view, watching, waiting. The house seemed alive with eyes that did not belong to human beings. The furniture, once grand, now rotting, stared back at me as though it knew me, as though it had witnessed countless souls before mine walked these halls. But it was when I descended into the basement that the terror truly began. The door was heavy, its wood thick and time-worn, and it resisted my touch at first. When it gave, it did so with a groan, as if the house itself were protesting my intrusion. Beyond the door, the stairs led down into a suffocating darkness, an abyss that seemed to press against my chest, tightening with every step I took. And then I smelled at the unmistakable, sickly sweet scent of burning wax. At first I thought it was an illusion, a trick of the mind, but no. The light, soft and flickering, was unmistakable. As I descended the stairs, my eyes strained to make out the source, and that was when I saw them dozens of candles, arranged in a strange, deliberate pattern on the floor of the basement. Their flames shivered in the air, as though caught in a wind that wasn't there. And the shadows they cast, those long, jagged shadows, twisted and danced on the walls, turning in impossible directions, as though the house itself were alive with them. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and I felt something cold slither down my spine. The whispers intensified then, no longer mere echoes in the air, but voices, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. In the darkness, it was no longer just absence. It watched me. I could feel it, pushing against the walls of the house, pressing in from all sides, trying to claim me as part of its own. And then I saw it. At the far end of the basement, just beyond the edge of the candlelight, stood a figure. A shape, no, a presence darker than the darkness around it. At first I thought it was merely a trick of the light, a distortion in the air, but no. There was something there. A silhouette. Tall, impossibly tall, standing in the doorway to another room, but it did not belong in that space. It was as if it had always been there, waiting for me to come close enough to see it. It was human, I think, but it was wrong. Its shape was too fluid, too distorted to be a simple man. It seemed to bend the space around it, and the longer I looked at it, the more I felt myself dissolving into its shape, as though I were becoming part of the air it inhabited. I don't know how long I stood there. The air grew heavier, more suffocating, and I felt the weight of its presence press into me. The figure didn't move, it didn't need to. Its stillness was the true terror, its mere existence enough to unmoor me from reality. My heart slammed against my ribs. The walls around me seemed to fold in on themselves, stretching and shrinking in impossible rhythms. And then, something inside me snapped. I turned. I fled. The house, no, the thing behind the house moved with me. It followed my every step, twisting the air as I ran, bending the space so that the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the door growing farther away with every step. The ground seemed to rise and fall beneath me, as though I were running on a surface that had no true form. The walls shrank, closing in on me, and the sound of something scraping slow, deliberate, crawling followed me, just behind me. The whispers. The distant thud of something heavy dragging across the floor. I didn't dare look back. My chest burned, my lungs fought for air, but the door was still so far away. The world seemed to contort around me, and then at last I burst through the door. The night air hit me with a sickening rush, but I didn't stop running. The house, no. The thing that was the house loomed behind me, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch forever into the darkness. I stumbled toward the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking violently, but I couldn't bring myself to look back at the house. Not now, I had to leave. And yet, as I drove away, I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't escape it. It had followed me, and it always would. And that brings us to the end of 3 chilling true horror stories from Fall Nights. We hope these eerie tales have given you that unsettling feeling, as the crisp autumn air seems to carry with it more than just the change of seasons. A huge thank you to all of you for your incredible support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions are what make this channel possible. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, and remember, sometimes the scariest things happen when you least expect them. We'll be back with more spine-chilling content in the next video. Until then, keep your lights on and your doors locked. See you soon.